Hello and welcome to the Chemistry Made Simple podcast. I'm your host, Matthew Macario, and this is the podcast where you get chemistry confident and we take you from point A to grade A. Hello, welcome back to the podcast and welcome along if this is your first time. Today, we're going to be talking about enthalpy and introducing the concept of enthalpy change. So to do that, we'll define what we mean by enthalpy, then we'll talk about change in enthalpy. We'll talk about the standard conditions which we measure enthalpy change, and we'll mention energy level diagrams too. So, what is enthalpy? Well, enthalpy is simply the total heat or energy content of a system, of a reaction mixture or a substance, if you will. And that in itself is not easy to quantify. But what we can do is measure the change in enthalpy by measuring the energy change that happens when a reaction proceeds. And we usually do that by measuring the temperature change, the amount of heat given out or taken in overall during a reaction. And that is the enthalpy change, the change in enthalpy during a reaction. Now, we always do this in standard conditions. That's what makes it an enthalpy change more than just an energy change. And the standard conditions that we use are always pressure of 100 kilopascals, which is more or less atmospheric pressure, and a temperature of 298 Kelvin or 25 Celsius, which is considered room temperature. And we use the symbol delta H to show that we're talking about an enthalpy change, particularly when we're putting a numerical value. And when we do that, the delta is the Greek letter delta. It's usually the capital, which looks like a triangle, followed by a capital H. So a delta and a capital H together. So a delta and a capital H together denote that the value that is being talked about is an enthalpy change for a reaction. As we mentioned in the previous episode where we introduced thermochemistry, this value is always going to be back to a quantity. So the value is always going to be in the number of kilojoules per mole. An enthalpy change that's positive is going to be an endothermic reaction. It's required more energy than it gave out. And a reaction that has a negative delta H, a negative enthalpy change, is one that gave out more energy than it took in, so it's exothermic. Finally, we're going to just mention that we can represent enthalpy changes on an energy level diagram, sometimes known as an enthalpy level diagram. This is a diagram that has on the x-axis the reaction progress or the extent of reaction, and on the y-axis energy or enthalpy. You'll usually see on the graph the reactants on the left and the products on the right at two different energy levels, and working out whether the energy is higher or lower when you get to the products gives you an indication of whether the reaction was exothermic or endothermic. So that brings us to the end of this episode. In the next episode, we're going to be talking about how we measure those enthalpy changes. If you've got any questions on this topic we've talked about today, then please do get in touch. And the best place to do that is in our podcast Patreon community at patreon.com/chemistrymadesimple. Just come along and ask your question there. That's where I'll be publishing the answers as well. Thank you for listening to this episode. I hope you found it useful. And if you have had value from it, do consider visiting our Patreon community at patreon.com/chemistrymadesimple, where you'll be able to ask deeper questions about this topic and get more support for your studies too. So I look forward to speaking to you again in the next episode. And until then, do look after yourself and goodbye.